So we all know how obnoxious Christians can be about morality, right?
But there would be no objective morality to even know unless God exists.
So on the naturalistic, atheistic view, there really are no objective moral values.
I'm not saying you don't know morality, Christopher. I'm saying you can't justify morality without a being beyond yourself.
They just love trying to pin non-believers down on this question about whether morality is objective or subjective. You know, if God exists, then there's an objective standard built into his will or his nature or something related to him, whereas if he does not exist, then it's all purely subjective. And we know why they do this. They're trying to contrast the comfort of somebody having a set of rules that we all have to live by against the chaos of there just being absolutely nothing except everybody's opinion and nobody can hold anybody to anything. Now, we all know deep down that there's something wrong with this. It's just kind of hard to put it into words, right? Now, I used to talk about this a lot on my channel. Maybe in the description, I'll put a list of videos where I discuss morality and why this is all kind of nonsense. But I've drifted away from it for a variety of reasons. Partly because it just gets repetitive if you just talk about that over and over and over, and I felt like I'd made my point. However, I recently saw a video where Alex O'Connell was responding to Stephen Woodford on this, and I kind of want to just dive in and give my 2 cents. So here we go. Now, there's something I want to make abundantly clear before we move forward. I'm not here to own or chastise Alex or Stephen in any way, not even really to argue with them. They're both smart guys. I'm more or less like them, even though they've had their controversies, and they're better YouTubers than I'll ever be, so I'm not here to put them down. This isn't even the end of their conversation. Stephen, I believe, had made some points about the nuance of language that are more or less the same as what I'm trying to say, even though I don't think he quite fleshed them out the way I'm going to. And this video is 6 years old. I think they've probably reconciled a lot of these issues and talked through them. So nothing about this is trying to contradict them, nothing even as much as that. I think the specific conversation they had at this point just provides a good snapshot for seeing how terminology around morality and the way we conceptualize it can cause a lot of confusion, a lot of problems, and really feed into this whole thing that apologists try to set up, this dichotomy between objective and subjective morality. So the reason I'm doing this now, by the way, it just popped into my feed. I don't know why, it just did. And when I watched this, I just thought it'd make a good illustration. So let's just dive right into it, I guess.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Alex, and Stephen, I hope you forgive me for the title of this video. I simply couldn't help myself.
Hey, Alex, don't worry about it. You didn't do anything wrong if morality is subjective.
Today, I want to respond to Stephen's Rationality Rules. His recent video called My Views on Morality is an interesting and unique take, but I think it fails for a fairly specific reason. Stephen and I have privately discussed morality at length and have some long-standing disagreements, and I thought it would be fruitful to make some of these discrepancies public.
Interestingly enough, I have a little bit of a history with this myself, even though it was from the sidelines. I saw Alex and Stephen having this conversation at the Second Faithless Forum, and I was just kind of dying to dive in and give my 2 cents, so I guess here I finally have my chance.
Now, Stephen advocates for the idea that morality is objective, that there are facts that can be known about ethics, and that ethical statements are propositions that contain truth value. He thinks that there are moral facts. I've always maintained a non-cognitivist approach, believing that morality is entirely subjective and has no basis in analytical or empirical facts.
And here we see the terms by which Alex, at least, is framing the conversation. Stephen thinks statements of morality can be factual or inherently true or false, meaning morality can be objective, and Alex disagrees with this to the point of calling morality entirely subjective. Now, these terms are incredibly problematic, at least in my mind, for reasons I'm going to go into later. For now, I just wanted to throw out the suggestion that this maybe doesn't work. Keep that in mind as we watch.
So to outline his moral ideas, Stephen begins by identifying the classic problem with trying to prove moral truths. That's the is-ought distinction attributed to David Hume. Essentially, this is an observation that statements about how things are can never inform statements about how things should be. Hume defines 2 types of statements. First, statements like X is the case, and second, statements like X ought to be the case. Hume writes that you can say X is the case, Y is the case, Z is the case, and you can keep going, but you'll never arrive at an ought. You can't say this is the case and therefore you ought to do this, because you're making a leap from description to prescription.
Now, I'll agree, kind of, depending on what we're talking about here. But I'm not sure that this conclusively categorizes morality as entirely subjective. Alex's point seems to be that you can't establish an objective fact behind an ought, and since morality ultimately comes down to oughts, there are no objective facts to be established about it, and thus it's subjective. Now, there's a formulaic neatness to this line of reasoning, and I can see some truth to this, but we need to be very careful in parsing out what this truth is and how much it tells us about morality. Part of the problem with this comes down to semantics. A lot of the words we use to discuss morality are so easily misunderstood that a lot of people think they're fighting over ideas when really they're just fighting over what words mean. I see the word ought doing a lot of mischief in this regard, especially when it's phrased as an ought, which, trust me, is something I'm going to get into later. But at this point, Stephen actually concedes Alex's point about this, at least to a degree. I'll let Alex let him explain.
I'll let Stephen explain.
For example, consider this seemingly sound argument. Premise 1, humans typically die if they're hanged. Premise 2, Ken is a human. Therefore, we ought not to hang Ken. This looks like a valid deductive argument, but it's not. It's a non sequitur. Even with both premises being true, the conclusion doesn't logically follow.
Of course, this is technically correct, at least in terms of how this syllogism works. Because the general principle in premise 1 is that humans die upon hanging, and the specific fact in premise 2 is that Ken is human, the actual conclusion it gets us to is that Ken will die if hanged. We ought not hang Ken simply doesn't follow. But I would be leery about taking too much away from this. The conclusion we ought not to hang Ken could very well be true and even connected to the premises in some way, even if the syllogism as laid out doesn't make sense. In fact, I guarantee almost anybody who reads these statements will come away thinking Ken should not be hanged. Or ought not be hanged, if you will. They might even think it follows if they read too quickly. This is the most interesting and I would say important thing we can take from this exercise, and I think it's what Stephen's trying to show us. This tension between this very deep gut-level conviction and what we can connect the dots to using airtight syllogistic logic. Exploring this disconnect can be the key to what we mean by morality and oughts, and in what sense they could even possibly be objective.
It attempts to get a prescriptive statement from descriptive facts, but it fails. Sure, humans tend to die if hanged, and Ken is indeed a human, but how exactly do these statements of fact tell us that we ought not to hang Ken? Exactly, they don't.
They don't because whilst it is the case that Ken will die if we hang him, we can't prove that this is a bad thing to do, that we ought not do it. That's an extra assumption that requires its own justification, and there's no amount of descriptive facts that could provide this justification. They're all is statements and have nothing to do with how we ought to behave. So far, this all sounds perfectly agreeable to me.
I think Alex's phrasing here can really help us probe at the disconnect I was talking about. He says there's an extra assumption that requires its own justification, adding, and there is no amount of descriptive facts that could provide this justification. Now, I agree that this assumption requires its own justification, at least technically. If we're going to do a detached analysis of terms that can be contained and justified on a logical flowchart, then sure, we need to feed more terms into the system before we can get from point A to point B. But is this really how justifying moral propositions works? And I'm posing that as a real question, I'm not being rhetorical. Because I see two sides to this. On one hand, we can't just appeal to gut-level intuition and say, this answer feels right and that's it. There needs to be some kind of analysis of either material facts or lines of reasoning that justify our moral propositions, or else they are just gut-level preferences. In fact, the very flippant preferences that apologists claim we have to fall back to if God does not exist. To use the crude terminology of those same apologists, our moral propositions need to be grounded in something. But on the other hand, something seems off about trying to reduce morality to a formula on paper. There's ultimately going to be a human element to our understanding of morality as a concept as well as to how we justify it to each other. So I think trying to reduce it to something that can be mapped out in a point-by-point logical sequence without any reference to human preference or expectations is missing something key to what morality is. Morality, by any reasonable definition, addresses something about the experience, behavior, and expected outcomes of humans. Or I guess to be more precise, of conscious beings. So is it any kind of failure if you can't create a chain of logical statements to justify our moral position on paper without these reference points? Does it tell us anything about the limits of justifying moral positions? Or does it just mean you're straining to use the word morality in a way that defies its very definition? Both of these positions are problematic enough that it seems there has to be something in between. That it isn't a binary choice between morality on one hand being describable in a way that can be detached from our humanity and on the other being purely subjective. There's a reality somewhere in the middle that's hard to get our heads around yet still accommodates the terms we use to describe morality. So when Alex says this conclusion requires its own justification, the kind of justification we're looking for probably threads the needle between an easy factual syllogism and a lazy "it just feels right." But he doesn't really look to thread this needle. His takeaway, and I know he's summing up Stephen's position, though he does it in his words to express agreement, is that no descriptive facts could provide this justification. This is where I see Alex generalizing just a little too dangerously. Before making this kind of absolute leap, it's important to know what kind of descriptive facts we're talking about and what kind of justification we're trying to reach. And I'm not trying to be pedantic. It is very important to make sure we're using both of these phrases in ways that square with what morality could possibly mean and what we can possibly expect from it. Now, Alex and Stephen agree that you cannot, using the first of these two options anyway, get from an is to an ought. For example, you can't get from a description of what happens when you hang Ken to a statement that you ought not hang Ken. But now let's let Alex explain how they actually disagree.
Stephen, and this is where the divergence occurs, Stephen says that you can get to an ought in the conclusion of an argument. He just says that you have to do it differently. So let's see what he means. But first, Stephen thinks that it's possible to produce a sound deductive argument with true premises that has an ought in the conclusion, but doesn't try to get an ought from an is. Now, let me be clear. If Stephen can produce a sound deductive argument with an ought in the conclusion that doesn't derive from an is, I will change my mind and believe morality to be objective immediately. He wins the argument, because the conclusion would have to be true. So let's see the rather fascinating way Stephen tries to do this.
So since they agree that you cannot get from an is to an ought, now the debate seems to hinge on whether you can construct a syllogism with an ought in the conclusion without starting with an is. Basically, can you use something other than an is in your premise? Now I can see how this provides some clear terms for who wins or loses this debate, but this kind of neat, tidy logic doesn't seem adequate for discussing moral conclusions. Or at least it's likely to trip over semantics and cause confusion. Again, like I said before, this seems at least to be operating with too much detachment from human expectation, behavior, and desired outcomes. But let's see what Stephen comes up with.
So how then can we derive a valid ought? Well, it's actually very easy. It's by having a valid deductive argument that includes at least one ought. Or in other words, it's by getting an ought from an ought. For example, premise 1, we ought to live consistently with our evolution. This is an ought. Premise 2, humans evolved to eat meat. This is an is. Therefore, we ought to eat meat.
Now there's some subtext here, which is that, as I think most of you know, Alex was a vegan, at least at the time of this conversation. So not sure if this was meant to be playful ribbing or what. But this does throw an interesting twist into this discussion. Can you use "we ought to do this" or "we ought not to do that" as a premise in an argument? As something that you should expect everybody in the conversation to agree with? This sounds suspect for obvious reasons, as Alex is going to explain here.
So, Stephen wants to get an ought from an ought. In other words, the is-ought problem is avoided by including an ought in the premises, rather than having the premises consisting of only is statements. We've seen that you can't get an ought from an is, sure, but you can definitely get an is from an is, and you can also get an ought from an ought. Okay, interesting. But your first question should be this. How can you know that a premise involving an ought is true? Sure, an ought premise could inform an ought conclusion, but you'd need to prove that the ought statement in the premise is correct.
This is a good question. How can you show that an ought statement is true? This is where the idea of objectivity most clearly enters the picture, at the individual facts you use to back up your argument. An objective statement is something you can refer to as an unambiguous matter of fact that somebody else is pretty much necessarily going to agree with you on. You can point at a dog and say that dog is brown, and another person is not going to have a non-pedantic way to disagree with you. It's just right there. You can say humans normally have 10 fingers, and another person is going to know that from experience, even if you're not showing it to them right there and then. But how do you establish the fact that you ought not murder? That's what Alex seems to be questioning here. The elusive nature of establishing an ought as a fact. You can't point somebody to an ought the way you can point them to a brown dog. You can't point them to a factual history of you ought not murder the way you can point them to a factual history of people seeming to have 10 fingers. At a glance, this seems to be an open and shut case for why you can't use an ought as a premise. But I see it more as the beginning of an interesting question about how we establish premises for discussion of morality.
The example Stephen just gave is a clever one because it has an ought premise that most people would consider to be untrue, and this identifies the problem. You can't just stick an ought in the premises, you have to make sure that the ought premise that you're proposing is actually correct. In order to produce a good deductive argument, the ought premise must be justified so that we can use it to inform our ought conclusion.
So as expected, Alex seems to be pushing toward the idea that you can't use an ought as a premise. He explains this in two different ways. First, he says you have to make sure the ought premise you're using is actually correct, then the ought premise must be justified. These statements might sound similar, but they're actually different in a way that can help us understand what we're trying to do when we establish an ought premise. To say that an ought must be correct indicates that it must be a matter of verifiable, possibly physical fact, right? At least it hints at that. To say it's justified just indicates that you need to get another person to agree with you. And what he said before this actually helps us see the difference. He said that Stephen used an ought premise that a lot of people would disagree with and that was kind of clever. Now this is interesting because it indicates that there are a lot of ought premises that more people would agree with, right? So we're kind of contrasting two different things. We're contrasting an ought premise with a factual premise, something you can actually point to, but we're also contrasting a highly agreeable ought premise with a ought premise that's controversial, that people are going to be divided on. And I don't think it would be that hard to come up with an ought premise that a lot of people would agree with, maybe even universally. Take you ought not murder. I think basically everybody, if not entirely everybody, is going to agree with that. And if you can count on people to agree with it, couldn't it be a reliable justification to use in moral conversations? You can't show it's correct in the sense of you can't point to you ought not murder as a fact of the universe, but you can point to it as something justified. That when you sit down with another person, almost anybody, no matter who they are, they're probably going to agree with you. And can't you use that as a justified premise? Again, not factual. You can't point to this as a condition of the universe or a fact the way you could point to a brown dog or how many fingers people tend to have. But somebody's going to agree with you and you can build a conversation on that. That seems important to me, right? This might, foreshadowing, give us a little hint about what objectivity might possibly mean in moral conversations.
So how does Stephen say that we can do this? How can we produce an ought premise that we know is true? Well, he makes a distinction of his own. Stephen says that there are in fact two types of oughts. He calls them axiomatic oughts.
Axiomatic oughts are feelings of obligation that exist self-evidently, and they do so without proof or argument. They just are. They're facts of nature.
And contingent oughts.
And contingent oughts are feelings of obligation that are predicated on axiomatic oughts and one or more statements of fact. And because they're predicated on statements of fact that may or may not be correct, they too may or may not be correct.
Now this might sound kind of dry and technical to some of you, all this stuff about axioms and oughts, but what it basically amounts to is this. You have to explain why you should and shouldn't do some things, such as don't drive over the speed limit because you might hurt someone. But there are other things that you don't have to explain, such as don't hurt people. We all just kind of know the second one without having it explained. And in fact, you can get to the point where you simply can't explain it any further. People just kind of accept it, and in fact, it's accepted so automatically that it was used as the basis for justifying the first one without going any further. This is what makes it axiomatic. We just take it as true. And humans pretty much across the board accept it as true. But the trick is why, right? That's the puzzler here. It can be a little hard to get our heads around why, but regardless of that question, I don't think the fact that people still do, the fact that people take that as true, is completely irrelevant.
The idea is this. You can't have a contingent ought in your premises because they're not self-evidently true, and so you can't know for sure if the premise is correct. However, you can have an axiomatic ought in your premises because these require no justification or proof. They're simply true. And if these ought statements are self-evidently true and we can know them to be true, then we can use them in our premises in order to get an ought in our conclusion. We can derive moral facts.
Now, with Alex saying so much about the nature of oughts, I think it's time for us to pause and finally address this use of the phrase an ought, or its plural, oughts. I kind of dislike this phrase because it's an imprecise use of language. Ought is a verb, so talking about an ought makes as little sense as talking about, like, an accelerate. Now, I guess it's fine to use this as some kind of verbal shorthand, but when you do, you need to take a lot of care to be precise about what you mean. I'm not sure people are in this case, and it creates a lot of confusion surrounding this conversation. When people keep referring to an ought, their use of ought as an abstract noun gives the impression of this intangible endpoint to the conversation about morality. Some kind of final commandment or moral imperative that's set in stone for either fully objective or fully subjective reasons. This can create a lot of confusion over what we're talking about and why. And to be frank, I think Alex and Stephen are spending a lot of energy wrestling with this very confusion. But that's really not what an ought is. It's not a declarative black box that the machinery of moral conversation leads you to. It's another moving piece in the machinery that needs to be taken apart and inspected itself. Really, the word ought is just a verb describing an expectation that something will happen. This can be an expectation that something is likely to happen, such as this weather ought to clear up by noon, or an expectation that something should happen, such as you ought to finish your homework before going out with friends. So if we refer to an ought, it sounds like we're actually using shorthand for an ought statement. Basically a statement that you expect something. Now this might sound pedantic, and I'm well aware that I might have crossed the pedantic sounding bridge a long time ago, but I'm not just splitting hairs to split hairs. Ought statements can have very different qualities. So until we understand, 1, what those statements are, and 2, what different reasons we have for saying people ought to do things, we're going to end up spinning our wheels wrestling with a lot of vagueness. Take the following statements. 1, I ought to set my alarm clock for 6 o'clock tomorrow morning. 2, people ought to set their salad fork to the left of their dinner fork. 3, people ought to follow Jesus. 4, people ought not murder. One of these is an expectation you set for yourself with a reason specific to your situation, that being that your life in the future will be better if you do the difficult thing and wake up early. The other 3 are expectations of other people. 1 only seems to satisfy a person's culturally ingrained sense of social nicety and probably comes off as frivolous to most people. So you can only justify it to people who share your sense that it's important that a meal follow specific traditions. The next satisfies expectations based on religious teachings and will be meaningless or even offensive to people outside that religion. So a Christian can only justify it to a fellow Christian. The third seems to appeal both to a person's sense of empathy for others and to their understanding that allowing murder will turn society into a dangerous place for everybody. This is something that you can justify to almost any person in the world just because of what humans are like. So we can see that an ought is not necessarily anyway some kind of commandment, some finalized declaration of the way things are supposed to be. It's an informal term for someone's expectation that things are going to be a certain way. When a person develops this expectation, we then come to the question of whether this expectation depends on people acting a certain way, whether they should be obligated to act a certain way, and whether that obligation should be enforced. This obligation, especially if it involves enforcement measures, is something that needs to be justified to other people. That's where an ought finally becomes a command. Now sure, you can use the word ought to describe some kind of hard-set moral imperative. I'm not the language police, and I know that common usage is a fluid thing. But the problem is that this use of the word runs up against the broader expectations that people use the word ought to describe. And this kind of overlap in the meaning of the word can create a lot of confusion when people are discussing morality. And so I think it's important not necessarily to use the word correctly, but at the very least to be aware that both of these usages exist.
I agree with Stephen that you can't get an ought from an is. I agree that you need an ought in the premises to get an ought in the conclusion. I just don't think that you can do it. I agree that if axiomatic oughts do exist, then you can use them in your premises and morality can be objective. I just don't think that they do exist. If I'm wrong about this one single thing, the existence of axiomatic oughts, my entire criticism crumbles. So let's jump into why I'm not convinced by Stephen's description of them, using his examples as much as possible. And if I seem to be repeating myself or overdoing a point, it's because this is quite a confusing topic and I want to ensure that we're all on the same page.
Axiomatic oughts are feelings of obligation that exist self-evidently, and they do so without proof or argument. They just are. They're facts of nature. An example is my current conviction that I ought to survive. I didn't reason myself into this ought, I just have it. It's an axiomatic fact of nature, not an assumption.
So here's where I see the confusion. Stephen is saying that it's an axiomatic ought that he ought to survive because he simply has that ought innately within him. But here's the thing, you don't have the ought to survive. You have a conviction that you ought to survive. When Stephen talks about axiomatic oughts, I think he's really talking about what could be called axiomatic desires. It's not that we innately ought to survive, it's that we innately feel as though we ought to survive.
And see, this is the very problem I said can arise when you use the word ought as a noun to describe a moral imperative. Alex is distinguishing between the axiomatic desire to survive and the axiomatic ought to survive. But they're the same thing, at least in a common sense of the word, and I think the sense that Stephen is using it. You expect to survive, ought to survive if I can be so bold, in the sense that you think it should happen. Basically, you want to survive. Based on this desire, you can set expectations of yourself, such as I ought to eat enough food and avoid dangerous situations, as well as expectations of others, such as people ought not murder me. Now, the frustrating thing about this is I'm willing to bet that Alex and Stephen pretty much agree on the facts of the situation, and their argument stems from the fact that they're using the word ought in different ways without even knowing it. Now, Alex continues from here to expound on this distinction. It's something I'd normally skip, but I think it's worth watching him reiterate, especially now that we've kind of clarified this, because this is where I see the conversation hitting its clearest and most avoidable misunderstanding. Keep the potential confusion in mind as you watch.
Now, he's right to say that you, quote, just have it. I think he's right that none of us reason our way into wanting to survive. We just do. This is a fact of nature. It's true that we want to survive. You could call this an axiomatic desire or an axiomatic predisposition. You just can't call it an axiomatic ought. Axiomatic means self-evident and unquestionable, and so to call the ought to survive an axiomatic ought means that it's self-evident and undeniable, an undeniable fact that we ought to survive. But I think Stephen is confusing the ought to survive with the belief that we ought to survive.
And see, again, I think the belief is the ought. That's clearly not what Alex means by it, but I think that's what Stephen's getting at, and it is a legitimate use of the word. And more to the point, it works. Even if you disagree over whether an ought means an actual commandment versus just a human expectation, knowing that distinction, being aware of it, can help us see where morality comes from and what actual axioms drive it. As far as I can tell, a command itself cannot be axiomatic. Every directive needs to have a reason behind it, right? So to call a command axiomatic is to say that people should do something just because you say so. And that's about the worst reason to tell people to do something. So I think an ought being axiomatic in the sense of a command being axiomatic is pretty much impossible or nonsensical just because of how we use language or what we expect of a command or an order. In short, there has to be a reason for a command. And that reason, if it's something people are going to take seriously, is going to be that it prompts behavior that is going to improve people's lives. Now, some of these behaviors will be personal, such as setting your alarm for 6 o'clock, and others seem arbitrary or based on questionable assumptions, such as table settings or following Jesus. But then we have not murdering, which people manage to agree upon almost universally. But why is this? Well, I think it's pretty obvious, right? It's because most people share what Alex calls Stephen's belief that he ought to survive. And more than that, people share the belief that other people ought to survive. As a rule, aside from, things like psychopathy, hatred, and othering different populations of people, we are bothered when other people are hurt or badly killed. This is what I think we're looking for when we try to find the axiom behind morality. It's a shared goal that we can all get behind, that we can all generally assume is good. We can't explain why it's good necessarily. We can't lay it out in a syllogism. We just kind of either feel it in our bones or in some way take it to be true. And when we talk to other people, we pretty much assume they're going to take it as true. These goals shape our values, which in turn shape the spoken and unspoken rules we hold each other to. And since we do this on an instinctive level without getting pedantic about why we want to survive, the rules feel natural and we take them as axiomatic, or even as our fundamental expectation or ought, even though the real axiom, the actual fundamental expectation or ought, is that we want ourselves and others to survive. And honestly, it doesn't matter which one we use the word ought to describe as long as we're clear about what we're talking about. It might help to explain this all with an illustration. And to do that, I'm going to compare morality to rocket science. As I asked in a much older video, let's consider the question, is rocket science objective? Now, part of rocket science is objective in the sense that it refers to verifiable facts about things like thrust, weight, inertia, trajectory, and things like that. I think it's safe to say that these facts are objective in the most obvious and uncontentious use of the word. These facts are the is of rocket science. But we also have the ought of rocket science. Where ought we send a rocket? What payload ought we send, and what condition ought it be in when it lands? There are all kinds of questions like these that can be asked depending on what you're hoping to accomplish and what you think you can get out of your current design. And you have to ask them if you're going to make any constructive use of a rocket. But here's the tricky thing. You can't get from any of the ises that describe how rockets operate to any of the oughts about what you hope to do with them. Sure, learning more about physics and engineering can help you become more skilled at getting a rocket to do this or that with increasing precision, but it can never give you a basis for figuring out what you ought to do with it. There are simply no material facts, no equations, no logical syllogisms to show that deliberately launching a rocket to a specific destination and safely delivering a payload is better than just randomly shooting it off to crash wherever it happens to go. So how do we answer questions about how we ought to operate a rocket? For example, let's say there's a rocket capable of delivering an important communication satellite into space. How do we come to the conclusion that it ought to be used to complete this mission? You might say it's more constructive to use it this way. But what makes that use more constructive than another use? Or as far as that goes, how do we decide that a constructive use of a rocket is better than an unconstructive one? You might say that it's more helpful to get an intact satellite into space than to simply crash the rocket. Fine. But why? And if you answer because it will provide better communication access to more people, I can ask, who cares? Why is a world with better communication access better than a world without it? You might give me a variety of answers ranging from people can stay in touch with their loved ones better, to lives can be saved by access to emergency services or public planning, to standards of living can be improved with better real-time logistics. But no matter what you said, questions about why all these things are better could persist ad nauseum. Yet I'm sure that well before this point, you've already recognized that these questions have become just annoyingly asinine. But if you're just looking for a self-contained flowchart that gets you on a purely logical journey from an is to an ought, then sorry to let you down, but you're not going to get there. At some point, even something like rocket science will be defined by a shared goal having to do with human well-being. You can't explain this goal. It just is what it is. We just agree axiomatically that human well-being is a good thing without even thinking about it. Which is why we don't waste all our time arguing like f***ing morons about whether it's better to use rockets to safely carry payloads or to crash them at random. It's the same with morality. Just as there are many objective facts about which actions will have which effect on a rocket, there are also many objective facts about which actions will have which effects on people. Withholding food or shelter or medical care from a person causes bodily harm and a distressed state of mind. We can know this fairly objectively. Certain ways we structure society can lead to more or less food, shelter, or care going to more or less people. These are all facts that can be established as objectively as facts about trajectory and thrust, even if they can't be known with the same mathematical precision. This is the problem with calling morality objective or subjective. As with rocket science, there is an entire body of objective facts that can be known about its workings, but at the end of it all will be a goal that's necessarily arbitrary, at least on paper, and that we just take as true based on our instinct about what ought to happen to people. In fact, that's how it works with every goal we have for everything. Like when we design beds, we don't argue endlessly over whether it's better for people to sleep on a mattress versus sharp rocks because what's our basis for valuing human comfort? We don't argue over whether it's better for people to poop in a toilet versus all over the floor because what's our basis for, liking sanitation and disliking bad smells? That would all just be stupid. For every single thing we do to improve our quality of life, we recognize that there are objective facts we can utilize to reach that goal, and we do that without breaking down into endless argument over whether on paper you can get from point A to point B in a discussion about whether human well-being is better than human suffering. We do this for everything except morality. As soon as we get to morality, then all of a sudden, out of the blue, we break down and turn into slobbering morons like, can we objectively prove that well-being and being happy is good? Duh. But why is this? Is it just because apologists have weaponized this conversation to score points? Or maybe it's just because morality is this intuitive but difficult to understand thing that we feel strongly about but can't fully describe. I don't know. But either way, it's just incredibly silly. But to get back to this question about objective versus subjective morality, I think the analogy to rocket science shows us how difficult it is to get to a flat declaration that morality, like any subject, is either purely subjective or purely objective. It's not really one or the other, because on one side you have objective facts and principles that help you steer toward a goal, and on the other you have a goal we try to reach for apparently arbitrary and unexplainable reasons, such as that we like being alive and unharmed. The second side seems completely arbitrary, which is why calling morality subjective seems to make a certain amount of sense. But is it subjective? Maybe kind of, but even that's a gray area. On one hand, it can be considered subjective in the sense that it's a matter of personal preference. I get that. But it's not the kind of preference that's going to vary from person to person as a matter of whim. When you run into another person, you're not going to wonder, as a rule, whether they share your values for survival or wanting other people to live or not be hurt, right? I mean, those people are out there, I guess, but they're extreme outliers that we'd probably label as having some kind of antisocial personality disorder. They're the exception that proves the rule. You immediately notice how abnormal they are because you do expect people to value life and human flourishing in roughly the same way you do. To me, and please stick with me here for a moment, this seems to make these kinds of values objective in a limited but pretty important sense of the word. See, when we say that something is objective, we mean that there's some kind of basis for different people to reliably reach the same conclusion about it. If I point and say there's a mug on that desk, everybody who turns and looks will know whether I'm right and wrong because the ability to check makes that fact very easily objectively verifiable. In a very similar way, if I say everybody has the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, most people are going to agree just about as universally. Now, will this statement be objective in some absolute sense that's built into the very fabric of the universe? No. Can we point to it like a coffee cup? Look at it under a microscope? No. But there is something more objective to this than simple arbitrary preference. And that's important to point out, because there's a nuance here that's sabotaged by the limitations of common language. Because while morality may not be objective in every sense of the word, trust me, I know that, there's an important meaning we can grasp by showing how the word objective can apply to it. That's all I'm trying to get at. We as people do very reliably seem to agree on the values of human survival and flourishing, and we use these shared values to help us, come to a pretty broad, at least, consensus on moral principles. Working out the details can get tricky, but we're not all going around wondering whether we should murder people and stuff like that. And if this doesn't fit every connotation of the word objective, it definitely also doesn't fit every connotation of the word subjective. And I think that's a really important point to make, because when we fail to recognize the way that morality defies the meaning of either word, we miss a lot of nuance. We fall to this dichotomy between objective and subjective morality, and when we do that, people can very easily nitpick over whether morality fits the objective of morality in every single sense of the word, and if it doesn't, then they just default to morality being purely subjective. Not only is this nonsensical, but it allows apologists room to run around insinuating that if we didn't have God, morality is just a pure matter of preference and everything would be chaotic, and we kind of need that structure or that authority. It pollutes the conversation, and that's just something we absolutely don't need in our lives. I don't want apologists doing that, And I don't want us as non-believers having conversations that feed into that. So, I don't know. This is a kind of area where a little bit of clarity can go a long way. This program was made possible by a grant from John Adams, Bob Generic, Maggie Danger, S.R. Foxley, Daniel Bostet, Dark Side of Delight Productions, Magnus Holmgren, and Q, and by the generous support of viewers like you. If you'd like to join them in pledging to this channel, please find a link to the Prophet of Zod Patreon below.